Mindset International and has worked extensively on water, climate, and urbanization, particularly in Asia. Using art as well as more traditional forms of publication, his work explores the mosaic of solution to emerging environment and other challenges. Naina Lal Kidwai is the chairperson of Altico Capital India Limited and Advent Private Equity India Advisory Board. She is the recipient of many numerous awards, including the Padma Shri. She is the author of 30 Women in Power, Their Voices and Their Stories, and Survive or Sink. And Varun Sivaram is a physicist, Chief Technology Officer of Renew Power Venture, India's largest renewable energy firm, and a senior research scholar at the Columbia University Center for Global Policy. And I must say, GRIS selected him as one of the top 50 leaders in sustainability, and PV Magazine named him as the Hamilton of the solar industry. So welcome to all of you, and over to you for the session.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I must say we're all extremely pleased to be here talking on this subject. I was talking a few days ago with Max Rodenbeck, who's the Economist bureau chief here, and he says, I asked me what we were going to talk about, and I said, oh, climate and energy, and he said, gloom and doom, you know. And I think one of the fun things about this kind of session is actually we can talk about the transitions and alternative visions of what those transitions might be. You know, I think for those of us who've lived in Delhi, you know, there's a little bit of a pressure there. I mean, you can walk on air there, and it's not always the best feeling to do it with the pressure there. So why don't we start out and really say, you know, to each of you, and you first perhaps, what do you see as the key elements in an energy transition? You know, where we can really harness a lot of what the power of the sun, where we can move away from some of the horrendous pollution impacts that we have at this stage? What do you see as the key elements?
Well, as someone who has embraced the whole space of climate change, what I would find very disappointing is the minute you mention climate change, people's eyes would just sort of glass over, and the connect just wasn't there. Okay, it's an issue out there, and scientists are arguing about it, and, you know, Trump doesn't believe in it today, but somebody else may believe in it tomorrow. But how does it impact me? I have more pressing issues. So I think the conversation that those of us who look at these areas has to have a far deeper connect with people and what they touch on. And exactly as you mentioned, Marcus, the minute you talk pollution, there are many elements to tackle pollution that impact climate change. So why not cotton onto the issues which citizens today absolutely embrace and connect with? Solve for pollution, solve for water shortage. And at the heart of both of these very key issues which we in India live and die with, you have solutions for climate change. So I think we have to change our rhetoric. And as we talk about these transitions that are so critical, the transition to clean energy, where solar and wind are at the heart of it. If you talk of it in terms of energy efficiency, which helps a nation that is energy short, like India, for those of you who understand the economics of our country, our foreign exchange rate goes up or down depending on the price of crude. Our fiscal deficit goes up or down depending on the price of crude, because we're a net importer of energy. We need to be much more energy efficient in terms of how we use energy in the country. So how we price for an air conditioner, which is energy efficient, is a decision we as citizens can make. The regulation can ensure that we have an energy-efficient air conditioner. The regulation should ensure that the ratings, as indeed India has, inform me as a consumer that I buy an air conditioner which is energy efficient, and if I have to pay a small premium for it, I recognize that in a year I will have saved enough on electricity cost to defend that price. So the decisions we make as consumers have to be made a lot easier for us. Producers have to absolutely align along some of that. Government and policy and regulation, of course, plays a role, but we have terrific policies in this country, often very poorly executed. So how you execute on the policy is equally key. So these transitions are often very good in theory. How we implement and the decisions we as citizens and consumers make are what will make the difference.
So, I mean, in many ways what you're saying is you have to listen at the local level, that society doesn't move where it sees the light necessarily, it moves where it feels the heat, and that's often coming up from the grassroots and the pressure, and that you have to respond and hear that pressure. Varun, you know, you've been looking at it, you know, from a larger scale, really at a structural level, and so it hasn't been so much about that you know, heat at the local level, but at the structures of when you look at that transition. And you know, if you were to paint a big picture and think about the transition, what would it be?
Thanks, Marcus. And let me just say thank you to the festival. I am thrilled to be here. I just moved to India. This is like the first cool thing I'm doing. This is awesome. And thanks, guys, for coming. I want to jump off right where Naina started, which is folks' eyes glass over when we mention climate change, and that's a bad thing. Now, Naina mentioned some ways that we can get folks more interested. For example, you can change the rhetoric to things that people care about, like air pollution. I want to give a different reason why I think folks' eyes glass over. I think folks are confused about climate change and the energy transition. You know, you may be bombarded with headlines that say, on the one hand, hey, solar power is growing like crazy. We are in the midst of an unprecedented energy transition. And on the other hand, you look out the window and you see, you know, ridiculous levels of smog. What is the truth in all of this? So let me start by setting the stage with some facts about where we are. The first fact is that the energy transition really, for all intents and purposes, hasn't begun yet. The amount of fossil fuels that we consume remains at an alarmingly high level, and the amount of renewable energy that the world consumes remains below 10% of all of humanity's primary energy consumption, and that percentage has not gotten much better over the last 2 decades. So that should scare you a little bit. Here in India, we talk a lot about the ongoing, unfolding energy transition, and indeed, the government's made a lot of progress in deploying renewable energy. But let me tell you something. If the government were to achieve its remarkably ambitious target, it's 350 gigawatts, that may not mean anything, by 2030. But if it hits that target, we're still going to have over 60% of the country's electricity coming from coal power, according to the Brookings Institution, by 2030. So my first point is, hey, the bad news, the energy transition really hasn't begun yet. What's the good news? Why am I up here? The good news is I believe we have an opportunity, a singular opportunity now, to move into clean energy at an unprecedented rate. And that's why I wrote my book, Taming the Sun. I picked what I think is the most important source of clean energy, solar energy, and I said, we do have a chance to decarbonize our economy, take away climate warming gases by moving into solar first and foremost, and then a whole range of other clean energy sources secondarily. I think by the year 2050, solar energy could generate 33% of the world's electricity. It's going to be really hard to get there, but we can do it. We're at 2% today. And by the end of the century, I think solar energy could produce a majority of all of humanity's energy needs. That would be a striking percentage. Now let's go back to Marcus's question, which is, what does an energy transition look like? It doesn't just look like solar. You know, we talk a lot about solar and wind, especially in the Indian context. But what about all the other technologies and sectors? Electricity may be the fastest growing energy sector, but industry accounts for 40% of India's energy demand. Transportation accounts for 14%, and fuel demand is going to triple by 2040. So we need a range of different technologies. The International Energy Agency says that out of 30 different technologies that we need, not just solar and wind, not just batteries, but also geothermal, hydroelectricity, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, clean cement, steel, bricks, we have only gotten ourselves on track on 4 out of the 30 top technologies that we need to deploy. So we're way behind. And that's why there needs to be work on a range of different technologies. Nana mentioned energy efficiency, not just wind and solar power.
Yeah, so the key elements that you see there are a much broader approach on technologies, things that address key elements of the energy demand side, particularly the transport and other things where we're not moving as fast. How do we connect some of that with that emotive level, the place where people come from at a local level, the daily lives? I mean, I think of it, I've worked a lot on adaptation. The first thing people do with the heat is put in an air conditioner. That, of course, is only the most wealthy. If I look across the central Gangetic Basin and look at what's likely to happen on the gloom and doom side, there's a lot more people who are going to want that and need it. What do you think on some of those elements there? Is it efficiency? How do you connect it emotively?
Well, this is a big question, Marcus, but I really come back to, I think in India today, we are at a very interesting turning point because of the attention that pollution is getting across our cities. People are feeling and breathing the air and worrying about their children and taking decisions to move out of cities that they can't live in because they have a sick child with them. Now, these are very real issues. Nothing connects with people better than the nadir that you hit in. And therefore, the turning point for us in India is to embrace this as that point of change. Because lo and behold, that politician who always looked at quick fixes and thought that odd even car numbers is the solution is suddenly having to recognize that, hey, there is an IIT report out there which talks about 5 key areas that need to be fixed. Whether it is the way public transportation is structured in the city, the cars that people drive and the quality of fuel that they consume, building regulations. We all live in homes where there are regulations, particularly in apartment buildings, on the efficiencies there, everything from sanitation to energy efficiency. And today, people are prepared to pay for a building that is platinum, certainly commercial buildings that are platinum rated or gold rated for energy efficiency. However, most of these regulations have typically existed on paper, and we have some excellent building regulations in the country at the state level, but they are barely observed at the levels they should be. Very easy to get a tick mark by a builder that the building is kosher. And how long does it stay that way? So you can tick the box that the sanitation part of the building has, in fact, got that sewage treatment plant. But 6 months later, is it working or doing what it should? Who is there to ensure that this happens? And I think that is where we as users can begin to ask the question and own what we own. Should we not ask these questions before we buy a flat? Should we not know where our shit goes? Should we not know how energy efficient that building is? But we haven't been trained to ask these questions. So at one level, it is education for us as consumers and communities so that we can keep governments, particularly corrupt governments, on their toes, on the one hand. On the other, to ensure that the regulation is indeed observed in every aspect is, of course, we can make them accountable, but of course, government has to step up to this as well. But I think we are at that point today. And if you look at, I will take the example of Delhi because of the fact that, least 2 of us live there or know it well. 3 of us, yeah. So you have a study which tells you that, yes, it is about cars. And so good news, you're getting electric vehicles in. Confusion, even today in my mind, is so where's the electricity coming from? If it's fossil-based electricity, is electric cars the answer? You know, so we need much more holistic policies in terms of, yes, the cars we drive. Delhi's made this huge step. We'll only register Euro 6 cars. We will jump from Euro 4 to Euro 6. Euro 6, supposedly cleaner, better cars, that helps. Buildings, building regulations, construction, better public transportation so people don't have to drive their own cars. You have to tackle it at every level. And in fact, there's a study which one of the not-for-profits I'm involved with, Shakti, has done on brick kilns. That there was a study which showed that almost 7 to 10% of pollution in Delhi is caused by the old brick kilns that exist in the city. How do you move these in a just way so you don't put people out of jobs, but make sure that the kilns, which were on the outskirts of Delhi but are now in the city and pollute, move? So there has to be a tackling at every level, and it has to be done in a cycle which goes beyond an election cycle, because some of these results will only show after the 5 years that a politician's life exists. So where are our NGOs? Where are our citizens? Where are we in the media on ensuring that what needs to happen happens, because the politician will only look at it for the short tenor that he sees as his vote?
Right. I mean, it's what you're saying in many ways is why I love air pollution, why I love fracking is because, you know, in Boulder, Colorado, where I actually live, fracking has generated tremendous opposition and movement among the wealthy. Air pollution is something that, unlike a lot of water pollution, the wealthy can't get away from. You live in it, so it creates the heat and it creates that pressure across. But it doesn't, you know, articulate or necessarily help the emergent demands at the local rural level, which is huge. I mean, you know, the wealthy section is 350 million of India. There's another billion. You know, so to me, you know, getting that pressure to emerge, how do we think about that extra billion?
But before I answer that question, Marcus, do you like fracking or not?
I mean, do I like fracking as a technology? I don't like it at all. Do I like fracking as a political thing where it means that it's not our oil is under their soil, it's our oil is under our soil and we feel it? I think that's a way of connecting.
Got it. So you like fracking because it gives the U.S. some geopolitical power and...
No, I like it because it means that communities that are wealthy have to pay the environmental costs of their transition.
So we're going to have an argument. Hope this gets you guys excited. I actually think fracking is one of the largest contributors to helping the United States reduce its climate impact. Thanks to fracking, the United States has reduced its emissions more than any other country around the world over the last several years, I think over the last decade, because our cheap natural gas has displaced coal and reduced our climate warming emissions. On top of this, as a former foreign policy analyst, I think fracking has really helped the United States increase its geopolitical influence. So I'm a big fan of fracking, but I do understand that its environmental impacts need to be curtailed. We can argue about this more, but I want to go back to the last couple points. Look, I came out here and I said, your eyes probably glaze over every time you hear climate change because it's confusing. And then what I did was I spewed a bunch of statistics at you, and then Naina told you a bunch of really cool solutions. But you're probably all still sitting here scratching your heads going, how do I make heads or tails of this? So let me try and do that for you. Let me try and answer the question, what are the top 3 things that India could do to reduce its climate impact? Because we've already mentioned like 11 different things. So what are the top 3 things? And by mentioning 3 things, I'm going to implicitly be mentioning things that aren't as important. top 3 things. The top one, in my opinion, is power market reform. The Indian electricity sector is going to be its primary driver of energy demand growth, especially as a growing middle class demands commodities like air conditioning. And speaking like a true American here, I do believe that we need more market forces in the Indian sector, that the Indian sector is not liberalized enough. And with more market forces carefully designed, we can create the right incentives for companies to generate clean electricity and also flexible electricity. Because the more wind and solar power you have, the harder it is to balance supply and demand. So power market sector reform, really wonky, number 1 priority. Number 2 priority, something that Naina mentioned, efficiency standards. If we set standards for buildings to be efficient, as you guys all know, 75% of India's buildings by 2040 have not been built yet. If we set building standards, we set car efficiency standards, we set manufacturer process efficiency standards for brick kilns, we can really curtail India's rising emissions. Because by 2040, India is certain to be the world's 2nd largest emitter of climate warming gases, and it could be the top emitter. What's number 3? Notice, I haven't mentioned, off-grid electrification. I haven't really mentioned, license plates in Delhi and having odd-even rules. Number 3 is innovation. I think that's the 3rd most important priority for India. Investing in the next generation of technologies. Around the world, countries have signed up to something called Mission Innovation, in which they're going to double their dollars that go into research and development from 15 billion to 30 billion in the next 3 years. India's got to be a big part of that. At my company, Renew Power Ventures, we're investing R&D dollars into new technologies and also customizing technologies to the Indian context. For example, making sure that when we invest in energy storage or batteries, those batteries can function just as well right here in the Rajasthani desert as they do, out in Germany or in California, and that they can function based on the unique characteristics of the Indian grid. So those are my top 3 priorities. I've left a lot of things off the list, but if you're confused about climate change and you want to solve it here in India, if you solve those top 3 things, you will be well on your way. You may not agree. That's kind of provocative, so I'm curious to know what you guys think.
Well, I mean, Naina, what do you think? Varun brought up the question of distributed types of things, the question of structural reform in there. When I look at a lot of the dialogue, a lot of it is around buildings, transport, grid, etc. Very little of it is about agriculture and the 70% or something like that of India that is rural, and that is not in Delhi, but is that in the Gorakhpurs of the world.
Well, I just love Varun because he's put everything into these 3 boxes, and actually, as I see it, pretty much everything can fit those boxes. So to your question, Marcus, if we begin to look for solutions for rural India, off-grid, any of this can fall into that bucket of innovation. So that simple solar lantern was an innovation. It was a very simple technology, but it brought electricity to villages who are going to remain off-grid for a while. They shouldn't remain off-grid. The country is committed to providing them conventional electricity, but by the time that electricity gets to them, or gets to them with any quality, 24-hour electricity, that solar lantern is an excellent solution. Smaller decentralized power may well be the interim solution as we go ahead, but we need the technologies. We need the innovation. And the innovation, and I fear we in India focus too much on the technology side of innovation, that tinkering that must happen in an IIT laboratory. Actually, the innovations I've seen work the most effectively are taking these very simple innovations, the solar lantern, but how to implement it at the village level. So you create this woman entrepreneur who runs the solar bank where people can come and charge that lantern, who runs the service where the women can repair the lantern. So how do you create the service infrastructure that makes very simple technologies work? And I think the focus on the business side of delivery allowing social entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs to make money, providing essential public services, is where we must also focus on innovation. So that innovation piece must be about entrepreneurship, social enterprise, and delivery of public services at the right price point to every human being.
Right. So it's innovation in an operational or a business model sense as well as in a technical sense. And I think that this is really beginning to get at my second question, which is, how is this going to occur? We're talking about innovation, we're talking about business models. I'd ask you, what are the roles of, for example, stories of this, in your perspective? The examples, and articulating it in ways that connect with people. Do you have a thought on that? We all talk about things that make people's eyes glaze over. How do you make it a story that catalyzes innovation, that catalyzes some of that heat that helps the transition?
Great question. Before I answer that, let me just say, I'm trying so hard here to be provocative. I gave you 3 different things, and I said everything else doesn't count, and then Nana says, no, I'll be a uniter. We can fit everything in those 3 different buckets. To answer your question, what role do stories play in catalyzing action on climate change? I really struggle with this question. Look, on the one hand, I am an apologist for solar power. I love solar. I want solar to grow by hook or by crook. And so when I see examples of people who love solar for completely different reasons for why I love it because it's going to help solve climate change, because it's going to bring energy costs down. But someone in, for example, a deep red Republican state in the United States, Louisiana, for example, loves solar because it gives them freedom, because they're a libertarian and they love to have their off-grid solar setup and don't have to depend on a publicly owned utility. On the one hand, I say, this is awesome. You love solar, I love solar, we can talk. But on the other hand, I do worry that trying to just sugarcoat my policy objective in whatever language is appealing to the person I'm talking to can sometimes obscure what I'm actually going for. Because, for example, if I try and achieve climate action in the United States without actually convincing everybody that climate change is important, then I may not ultimately achieve my climate objectives. Early on, Naina mentioned, hey, let's cast
Try
things...
your president.
I'm sorry?
I said, try with the president.
That's why I fled Washington, D.C.
The vacuum of the brain. Anyways.
Nana started by talking about how we should recast our climate dialogue to talk about air pollution, for example. Well, that's a great idea. Many of the things that we do to solve air pollution are also going to help solve climate change. For example, if you take cars off the road, you can reduce air pollution and you can help climate change. But that's not always true. Let's say for the sake of argument, as China did, you took a coal power plant that was right next to the city and you moved it far away. And you built a long transmission line. So the power plant now is this coal power plant sitting in the west where there's these hinterlands, there are not many people, and you run a power line into the city. Now the city has cleaner air, but the same amount of coal is still being burned. In fact, more coal because you lose some in line losses as you transport it. That's not great for the climate. Similarly, as we were talking yesterday, in Europe, Europeans decided to go all in on diesel fuel. Diesel fuel is great for the climate because unlike gasoline, you need less diesel for every mile you drive. So that means you burn less fossil fuels. The problem with diesel, however, is if you burn diesel, you also create air pollutants in a local sense, SOx and NOx emissions. And so Europe has become, in an urban sense, more polluted than many cities in the United States that depend on gasoline. So it's not always true that the things that you do to achieve one policy objectives will automatically achieve the other policy objectives, and that's what scares me about trying to tell stories about the things that people care about instead of the thing that I care about. The thing I care about is climate change, and let me not mince words. Climate change is an existential, once-in-a-several-generations challenge. Everything else is subordinate. And I understand that people don't like talking about climate change, and they would prefer to talk about their own local problems. But if we don't solve climate change, not only our generation, but generations hence, for 10,000 years, will suffer as a result. So we better solve the problems that deal directly with climate change. And that may be a terrible public relations strategy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I totally agree on one level, and I totally disagree on another level, in the sense that on one level, you know, climate is existential. On another level, if people don't come with you, you can be as much of an evangelist around climate as you'd like, and it isn't going to move the needle because the people aren't going to come with you. And you'll get the opposition, you know. And I think that that's been a big feature in, you know, our orange toupeed leader. You know,
And yet, you know, the US, I was very struck. I was at the COP24 discussions and actually deeply engaged in some of the financing aspects, the green finance spaces to do with COP24 and climate change. And I was very struck by some of the statistics that one or two of the think tanks I'm engaged with put out, which is that the US is actually going to be on target for its climate change. You don't agree? Well, I mean, really, well, these are pretty credible think tanks, and they had nothing to do with the government. And they believed that despite the public stand that countries like the US take, there's a lot of stuff happening on the ground, and that the US would actually meet its target. So we'll wait and see. But I think really where that leads me to is, of course, at the regulatory level, a country needs to determine its strategy. But it's not one that is easy to communicate across the boards. And you can't convert everyone to it. I mean, you have a problem if the president doesn't agree. But if, and indeed a country like India, water short, depending on its glaciers to provide for it, cannot understand that we, as a water-stressed nation, are going to get seriously water-stressed if we don't address issues that impact us, then it is an issue. We can try and communicate it to the people of India, but certainly at the policy level, there has to be an embracing of what needs to be done. And then the communication part must hit at what works with citizens. And not every piece of it, Varun, to your point, will actually fit the climate change argument, but at least pick the pieces that do, so that I can decide when I buy that air conditioner that it's energy efficient, that when I understand what the fridge means in terms of HFC, and that the decisions, therefore, that regulation can impose is very simple, that if I have a ranking of 1 to 5, that I buy 5 as that excellent energy efficient fridge rather than 1. So I think what we miss is this policy making at one end, and we being allowed to take that decision for ourselves based on information which is accurate, transparent, and correct. We need many more communication experts that can help us make those decisions, and in time, hopefully also therefore influence who we vote for and how that policy is set. We miss that connection.
Totally.
Yeah? You talk to anyone in India about water, the poor today pay more for water than you and I will, just because water is so mispriced in the country. People relate to water. If we can make that connect between water and climate change, because the two are so intricate and intimately connected, maybe we will learn to embrace climate change. But it's a huge communication story out there, not an easy one to tackle.
Right.
If I can quickly just
sure,
piggyback.
hop in.
This is just a fun conversation topic. I think you and Marcus both make an excellent point, which is probably better than mine, which is, yeah, if you don't communicate based on what people care about, you're not going to get them to change. And there are many of these types of things, like efficiency standards or air conditioners, where you can both communicate to them, hey, this will help your pocketbook, and it also will help the climate. And there is a genuine win-win there. I want to give one example of where this communication strategy, in my opinion, is leading to damaging consequences. And you guys can tell me if you disagree. In parts of the West, for example, in the United States, where I just came from, there's this movement toward 100% renewable energy. Cities, companies, states are signing up for 100% renewable energy. And it's this catchphrase, you know, we have a Congresswoman, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who is, you know, championing this. It sounds great in theory, And I'm all for renewable energy. Look, I work for a renewable energy company and I wrote a book on solar, but I think it's a terrible idea. And in the rush to support 100% renewable energy, which communicates really well, decarbonization doesn't communicate very well, we have caused folks to reduce their support for nuclear energy, for example, or support for technologies like burning fossil fuels and capturing the emissions so they don't escape into the atmosphere. Both of those are equally good for climate change. In fact, nuclear energy is our best tool against climate change. But we don't support such technologies when we follow catchphrases and slogans that communicate really well and get a really large audience. So that's an example of something I'm scared of, and I think we should follow your strategy, which is, in the cases where we see wins for climate and wins for another objective, like a pocketbook, or your air pollution, your health, or your water, we should communicate those. But we should be careful about communicating other things that could have deleterious effects on the fight against climate.
I just hear you making a case for stories.
There I go.
Okay, that's exactly the point. I mean, there's a question of what stories and how you tell the stories. There's also the point, often that you need the extremes to move the center. So you can have it, but there is a question of what stories, and there are the question of the blockages. And usually when we talk about this transition, we think of blockages as being the fossil fuel industry, for example, and things like that. But you're highlighting the idea of blockages being unrealistic expectations, or moving in a strong way on something that isn't gonna happen or isn't gonna work, and that closes off, and where we have our myths. I mean, your thought on these? What are the key blockages? Where are our myths? Where are our stories? Where are other things stopping us from moving? Where are our structures?
So when I was putting together my latest book, SOS, Survive or Sink, and it covers sanitation, water, pollution, the urban environment, and finance. And you would wonder why all of this is under one book. And the reason really is that there are interlinkages. And it's to Varun's point. You can't just shout renewable energy. You have to begin to look at the interlinkages across every platform, because one impacts the other. A classic is, of course, the power sector. 30% of India's power shuts down over the summer for lack of water. Because, hey, what you don't realize is you need water to cool those cooling towers in order for a power plant to work. So the interlinkages across these sectors are huge and required. But if you look at every policy, because every government is organized in verticals, which only thinks about that vertical and that policy. And by the way, in India, we have 7 different ministries dealing with water. So even water isn't interlinked the way it should be. So I think we have to get beyond silos and look at overarching policy, and that becomes key through think tanks, through government at one end. But at the other, for those that must implement on the ground, we have to make it simple, straightforward, and give people a chance to move ahead. But there is one area which can attack every one of these, and we never use it effectively enough. And as an erstwhile banker, it's finance. Nothing can move ahead without money and finance. And we can pay a lot more attention to what is it that we want to finance. I mean, Marcus mentioned, India has yet to build 80% of its infrastructure between now and 2030. If you look at roads and power and everything that we need, what we build and the quality to which we build it could either be the leapfrog we did in telecom, from the dark ages of having to wait 2 years for a phone to having one of the most robust telecom systems in the world. So do we leapfrog to that next new era that saves us, forget saving the planet, on the one hand, or on the other, as we look at how and what we finance, there's a whole area of what we must not finance. And we sadly do not have a norm in this country which we as Indian banks have established as a standard of what we will not finance. That we will not finance that builder who builds a building which actually breaks regulation. Do we ask for that certification to ensure that we will only finance what complies? I'm not even saying create a whole new regulation. And on the other, that when we look at the power sector or the next steel plant or the cement plant, that it's not enough for me as a foreign bank with a policy that the foreign banks have of not lending to certain sectors that do things wrong. Every bank in India must follow a similar standard, which may be different to what the foreign bank follows, but it should be an Indian standard, because otherwise that polluting industry is just going to go over to the bank that funds it. China has today advanced hugely, and it's mainly Chinese government-owned banks that fund 80%, to a standard which they are setting as an acceptable one. In India, we are limping towards a policy, but we need one. So finance can certainly drive what is right and wrong, and we don't pay enough attention to it.
So follow the money or direct the flows of money, as a critical thing. What do you think on that? The finance flows as structures, and again, how does that relate back to the hundreds of millions who aren't in the urban areas, who are in other areas, and where a lot of that emerging demand is likely to come from?
Look, I really like that Naina brought up financial innovation. She's been broadening the scope of innovation, and it's really important. It's not just gizmos and gadgets, it's also business models and ways of directing flows of finance. There's one thing that Naina said that I'm going to qualify from my perspective, which is this concept of leapfrog. I get worried when I hear leapfrog, because leapfrog sounds to me like, hey, the West did things in this way, but we're going to skip over them and do things in this way. And that's good for some things. It worked for example, cell phones. You skipped over landline networks. That analogy breaks down when you talk about the electricity grid. Please, I don't want to leapfrog the electricity grid. The electricity grid is really important. So when we talk about financial flows, I want financial flows to support really big transmission lines. We need them badly. Really big transmission lines are going to make it possible for me to generate a ton of renewable energy, and for that renewable energy to be piped from where it's in excess to places where it's in deficit. But I'm with you that it's probably a really good idea for banks, both domestic and foreign, not to finance that next coal power plant. That's a great idea. Or not to finance that next inefficient steel plant. So I just want to make the point that this leapfrog heuristic can sometimes mislead us. Now, that's not to say that you can't leapfrog at all. Marcus mentioned that there are over 300 million people in India who lack any access to electricity. I strongly believe that most of those people, if and when they get electricity, it will be thanks to the central grid. But a large portion of them, maybe a third, 100 million people, might get electricity based on less centrally tied solutions. Solutions like microgrids. Such microgrids, according to a Nature climate change study that came out of Berkeley, where Marcus did his graduate training, so you can't tell me I'm wrong here.
Right. Maybe I will.
About a third of globally unconnected households might get energy access thanks to distributed, decentralized off-grid solutions like microgrids. But 2/3 are going to get it thanks to centralized solutions. The grid's not going anywhere. The grid is a really good thing. We should not try and leapfrog the grid, except in very targeted situations, because the grid is actually quite an efficient way of pooling energy supply and demand. It's very different and disanalogous from cell phones. The last thing I want to say, Marcus has been giving me a hard time. He says, what are your stories? Come on, man. And you know what? At the end of the day, you're right. Here we are at the Jaipur Literature Festival, right? And when I ask people, hey, did you like my book? Did you like chapter 3? There are a lot of charts and graphs. They're like, no, we hated chapter 3. We liked chapter 1, or we liked, chapter 5, because you told us a story. There was a story where I worked for a solar energy company, and I was really inspired, and we made a new technology, and then we went bankrupt. And they loved that story. And that's what made the book tick. So here at the Literature Festival, I'm having a great time listening to folks who are storytellers. Not just hearing their stories, but hearing the technical ways that they get their stories across. Jan Martel taught us about how to technically use allegory, symbolism, and various other literary devices. I am no Jan Martel, but I'm going to try and put symbolism in my next book.
Right.
And I want to disagree finally with Varun. Yeah. And that is that the utopian solution, yes, we should have this great grid that takes electricity to every corner of India. And I work in sanitation. And even a city like Delhi, with difficulty, cleans 50% of our fecal sludge today. So, yes, this great Western model of big sewage systems, which are going to take 10 years to build and cost a lot of money, we are going to be playing catch up forever. The solutions have to lie in what we need today, which is a distributed grid to solve for sewage. It costs 1/8 of what that big sewage system is going to cost. We can put it into the hands of micro-entrepreneurs and not wait for a municipal corporation that has been sitting on its butt for the last 100 years. And it will solve for the problem today, even while we play catch-up on this great grid. Utopian solutions are all fine on paper. These microgrids, whether in power or sewage, are the answer. And we need to create an ecosystem where the municipality enables entrepreneurs to come in, the private sector to work, to make money, not at a rapacious level, but to make money and to survive and give us the public services we need at a price point that we are prepared to pay for.
Right. So in many ways, what we're hearing here actually is not that much disagreement. It's, it is that, Varun starts out with stories, a contrast between utopia and dystopia. We talk about the need for large-scale grid stuff, but at the same time, we talk about the need for, distributed types of things. I think the point under there is that, we need 1,001% solutions, and it's going to be messy as we go through this. So we're supposed to leave some time for questions, and we've got about 14 minutes to go. But I want to have a quick thing here beforehand, and that is really if each of you were to reflect on India and say, what does this mean? Where could it go globally? Where's India's comparative advantage in this? What could this teach other areas? Because you've talked about lessons coming from outside and not rejecting theirs. What are the key things that could emerge here that could really show the world something different? Varun starts us. I've been back and forth, and then Naina, and then we'll open up for some questions.
So let me give two things that I think India could teach the world. India, we talked about this yesterday, India has the power of public procurement. And it's demonstrated, for example, in its mass procurement of light-emitting diodes, that India can, in fact, drive down the cost of a global commodity and induce innovation, making those LED lights even better. And India succeeded in that in a way that no other country has, and other countries can learn from them. They may not have India's scale, but this is an approach, a public policy approach that really worked. Another example of where India, I believe, is a world leader is in its use of reverse auctions to induce very low prices of clean energy. I work in an industry where the cost of solar or wind power has fallen over tenfold in the last decade, and it's thanks to, in large part, Indian policy design that said, hey, we're going to have the government playing a central coordinating role, in contrast, for example, to a very market-oriented economy from where I come, but we're also going to encourage market competition among different developers, for example, of solar and wind projects. Now, this isn't without its flaws, and there are still some kinks to work out, but I really like that the Indian government has taken the lead on driving down prices. Now they've got to focus on other things. Prices are quite low. The rest of the world can learn from this, especially countries in the global south that are looking to replicate India's success in its renewable energy boom.
Naina?
So I think technology, innovation, we have a very strong engineering base, and the innovations that we make in these spaces which apply to India are actually the innovations which can help a lot of the emerging world. I think we have to move away from a plan where it is Western models imported into India, you know, large sewage systems, big pipes, all of that, because we have already cities which you can't dig under and put infrastructure in. So we need the solutions here and now, the retrofits that have to happen, and those technologies, innovations, the microgrids, the solar lanterns, the solar cook stoves, small and big, are what India can and must contribute to the rest of the world. And the second is India has embraced the international, you know, and actually been at the forefront with our current Prime Minister of the International Solar Alliance. So where we lead on solar can be a very interesting space for the world to follow, because India will build the most, well, China and India, amongst the most significant solar capacity going forward. And how we innovate on those is going to be key. And those innovations are going to be very small and sometimes very simple innovations. So for example, Rajasthan, you've got these solar panels all over the desert and it's fabulous, they work. However, simple technologies to clean these solar panels of dust have become key. So robotics, the roles you play in every little innovation that enables these panels to continue to work are all part of what India can contribute to making things work for the rest of the world.
And my own feeling is, if India can demonstrate how to have this hit at the rural areas in the communities that aren't educated now and that are the growing demand, that will be a contribution, but it's a huge challenge. That is the next one. And that's where we have to break a lot of the political nexus that has happened globally around some of the blockages here. So now opening for questions. See the woman over here? Sorry, there's not going to be enough space for everybody, but yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing what you did. Yes, the questions were, as you mentioned, we have no clue to what it's all about. But looking at India and the scale that we're all aware of, and I work in a village as a sarpanch, where there is absolutely no knowledge of what it is that we can possibly do, be it in the field of sanitation or renewable energy or any of it. But at the same time, here are the people who actually get most affected by it, as you yourself said. Now, when we speak of sharing these stories and articulating, what is it that we can do? And I believe the beauty of India is the fact that we have the panchayats, who, if we understand how to articulate this well and how to execute, I think we can do the bottom up without really having to focus on the silos that Nana spoke about that the government has. That is a little difficult to break out of. So how can we engage the grassroots and actually execute? Of course, it requires a lot of customization, which I've noticed doesn't happen easily because it requires a lot of finance, a lot of funding, and so on and so forth. But what can we do to engage at the grassroots with organizations and companies who are innovating, who are in the renewable energy space, and change the face at a faster pace in a more positive manner?
I'll take 3 questions before going in. Right here. And make sure it's a question.
I am Madhvendra, and I have a team. We are working with a 5 megawatt project in a rural development. That is a solar thermal turbines, and we don't have the technology. And we are working with another challenging area. That
Can you
is
make sure it's a question quickly, because we were going to lose.
Yeah, that is one of the R&D. We are working with the indoor air quality by the sensors, that is a smell sensors. So how we can connect with you to implement this project in a rural, and these are the very challenging, how you can measure the IOQ of the HVAC and the mines. So please comment on that.
Okay. And one more in the back, a woman there. No.
Sorry, I have 2 quick questions. One is the National Institute of Urban Affairs is coming up with a master plan for Delhi in, I think, for 2020. I'm sure the other cities also are coming up with master plans. Are all these issues adequately covered in those master plans? Is it something that NENA, for example, having a prominent position in so many committees, could push? My second question is, there are a few success stories. For example, municipal authorities are using dairy waste to produce biogas because the dung was causing waterlogging in the systems. Ethanol is being produced for the transport sector.
Your question,
Bio-CNG is being
please. Your
taken.
question.
Yeah,
Time is
my
little.
question for the second part was, can the media focus more on these issues because they are so evolved in politics and elections and they sort of don't focus on these issues?
Okay.
How could you all help us in that direction? Thank you.
Nina starts and then...
So let me tackle that last question. Clearly, media has a big role to play in terms of education, but we also need platforms where best practices can come forward and be shared. And you'd be surprised that even when we have the solutions in one part of India with a municipality that's doing something well, how little of that gets replicated across municipalities in other parts of India. So platforms for sharing are key. In fact, that's one of the reasons some of us set up the India Sanitation Coalition. It's just to ensure that best practices get shared and that we create partnerships between corporates, government, NGOs to work together in replicating some of these best practices. But we can do a lot more there. Media can certainly play a huge role there. There's no denying that. In terms of, if you think you have a solution that's working, the only way you can do this is to continue to showcase this and discuss this. You ultimately have to have a user who buys that technology or that model, because otherwise, and how do you do that? There are today forums, whether they're venture capital or otherwise, that look to support some of these. But is it easy? No. You just have to keep plugging away to make sure that happens. And in terms of the panchayat and the role that everyone can play in engaging there, what better than people like yourself to guide us as to how best to position it? Because you are so right that unless we can work right down there, and we're lucky to have someone as articulate as you as a sarpanch to help work out the models that matter, and the implementation at the grassroots happens in a successful way and in a meaningful way.
Varun.
Really fast. I think you answered the third question really well. I just want to say Anita, who asked it, is an excellent journalist who writes these really cool publications. So I think you are starting to get the media to cover all of these awesome issues. Second question, I'd be happy to talk after the event. First question, again, I couldn't have said it better. You're a phenomenal spokesperson for those communities. The one point I do want to make is some of these communities, rural communities, may be very affected by climate change, as you mentioned. So it's really important to make sure we help those communities adapt to climate change. But those communities are probably going to play less of a role in mitigating climate change than are India's urban communities, which are more intensive users of energy. And that's important to remember. It's not particularly important that rural communities, drastically reduce their energy consumption. They shouldn't. Or, drastically change from fossil fuels to clean energy. They may want to do it for other reasons, health reasons, for example. But from the perspective of climate change, let's focus on adaptation in these communities.
Next round of questions.
I think maybe we can take just one or two questions.
Just a couple of questions, yeah. And make them very quick, because we'll just have a moment to...
Yeah. Hi, my question is oil and gas scared of sun and wind energy?
Great question.
And one in the back, gentleman there in the... Your hand up right there. Yep.
So my question would be that similar to the rural background, what would be the importance and we need to bring into our schools so that this research can be driven from the 10th standard, 12th standard, where students can think of the projects on the lines of renewable energy, on the lines of sustainability.
The question?
What could be done in those areas in school curriculums?
Good. So quick. Yeah.
So the oil and gas sector, is renewable energy a threat? I think if you begin to look at the world's big oil and gas companies, they've all embraced renewable energy. And I don't think it's just a statement. They actually are actively looking at renewables as part of their portfolio. And frankly, they have to do it as part of their PR anyway. So I think there is need to work on that together. And the solutions must lie in finding the right grid solutions, because right now we struggle in India to embrace wind and solar into our grids, because for technical reasons, the surge that happens with these two still requires base loads, which are not going to come from renewables. So those solutions are going to have to lie with the sector as a whole to also help us find the solutions. I think was it on innovation, the second question?
Yeah, it's the rural innovation.
The rural innovation and how schools can actually look at this. There are tinkering labs, which I was just discussing with someone only at breakfast this morning, which have come up in schools, some 30 of them, at the school level. They're not specifically for renewables, but they're there in order to encourage school children to look at innovation in these tinkering labs. I don't know how well.
We have only a few seconds left, and I should give.
Okay, so just some of these ideas would be very important going forward to encourage innovation from the school level, which then translates to action at college.
Varun, the last bite of the time.
All right, I'm going to speed read. Are oil companies scared of solar and wind? No, because solar and wind generate electricity. Oil tends to fuel transportation. They are not direct competitors in most cases. Are oil companies ultimately scared of renewable energy? Yeah, maybe. They're a little scared of electric vehicles, but not really. Are gas companies, who in some cases are oil companies, are they scared of renewable energy? Sometimes, because renewable energy can compete with gas, but as Nana mentioned, gas can be a complement to renewable energy if you structure your power markets correctly. India should have way more gas than it does right now, because gas can ramp up and down to compensate for the fluctuations of wind and solar. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you all.
A big round of applause for Varun Sivaram, Nana Lal Kidwai, and Marcus Monch. Such a lovely